It's going live, John. Hey, everyone. I hope you're enjoying John's happy dance. This is Craig Von Buzik. I'm here with the famous dancer from, you were on Saturday, or what was it? Solid Gold, right? One of the Solid Gold dancers.
That was before my time. That was before my time. So no, I was not. I was probably just a twinkle in my parents' eyes at that time.
But you did dance up with people. Am I right?
Are we going to revisit this? Yes, I did.
You danced with it, and so we
just got everyone danced. I didn't dance. I wasn't a featured dancer,
but you danced, and we just got a sampling of it. That was very exciting.
That wasn't an up with people dance.
So welcome everyone. Good evening, as we say. Good morning and good afternoon from wherever you're tuning in around the world tonight. Welcome to this edition of Stories and Myths, where we are celebrating the release of the companion book. This is the book that we've talked about so far, Victor, the Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant. And this week, LPC Books and Iron Stream Media has released the companion book, which is called Forward, the Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant. And so we are celebrating the release of this book. And we welcome everyone. If you are...
Do you have a copy of it? Do you have a copy of it?
Not yet. No, I don't have a copy yet. But if you are interested, you can go... Thank you, Kelly. If you're interested, you can go to Facebook and go to Forward, ! And it will pull up the page, Forward, the Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant, and you can become a part of that group. And anytime there is a release having to do with the Forward book, you'll get a little blurb. Same with the Victor book. If you go to Victor ! The Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant on Facebook, you'll get the Facebook page and you'll get all of the updates. Thank you, Gary. Woohoo. I appreciate that. It's good to see you.
The Wahoos from Virginia.
The Wahoos. Yeah, exactly.
That's their nickname, the Wahoos.
Who are we? What in the world are we talking about?
The University of Virginia Cavaliers. Their nicknames, they're the Cavaliers, but a nickname for them is the Wahoos.
Okay, another pulling something out of the ether to make important.
That's where I am today. Just all over.
I could tell by the dance and the Wahoo comments. So.
I won't dance anymore.
At any rate, what do we got on the agenda for tonight?
Well, I have a couple questions about your book for the Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant, and then we'll dive into a little bit of how that applies to Grant's leadership.
Very good. All right.
And then we'll end, if we have time, with one question about NASCAR.
And if anyone in the audience has a question about either the Victor or the Forward book, or a question about history in general, you can ask it in the chat room, or feel free to go to my website, vonbuzik.com, and ask the question there. One of our people from our audience did do that, Marlene. And so Marlene wrote a book about the Tulsa race riots.
Oh, wow.
And so sometime in July, Marlene is going to be our guest on this very program, and we're going to talk about her book and about the history behind the Tulsa race riots.
Nice.
So you type it in there, and it comes out over here.
And also, if you have any suggestions of other future topics that you would like us to talk about, history, myth related, let us know in the comments, and we'll take that definitely to heart and see what we can do in the future.
All righty.
All right, you ready to go, Mr. Von Buzik? Or Dr.
I am ready to go.
I'm sorry, I should not have called you Mr. Von Buzik. It's Dr. Von Buzik. So,
well, that too. Yes.
All right. So, what led you to write your new book for the Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant? Just going to start off with a slow ball.
Well, as I mentioned with regard to Victor, I started to become interested in the last 2 years in the life of Ulysses S. Grant and Ulysses S. Grant in general, back around 1999 or thereabouts, when I first watched the Ken Burns series on the Civil War and started to learn about this what had happened to him in the last 2 years of his life. And so I started just reading whatever I could on him. I started going to all kinds of different, and it was even before then that I had been going to all different kinds of Civil War sites and museums and historical societies and so forth. But then it got ramped up. Actually, in 2012, I was thinking of writing the book, but then someone else wrote a similar book. And so I decided to go ahead and write I Am Cyrus, which you see behind me there. There. I Am Cyrus,
Kind of.
Harry S. Truman, and the Rebirth of Israel right there.
You can see half of it.
But the Grant story just wouldn't leave me. And so then about 3 years ago, I started a deep dive. As soon as I was done with I Am Cyrus, I started to do extensive research on Grant. I read probably 25 or 30 books about Grant, about the Civil War, and about Reconstruction. I watched every YouTube video I could find. I listened to every podcast I could find. And I went to a lot of the different locations. I went to several of Grant's homes. I went to his birthplace at Point Pleasant, Ohio, right on the Ohio River, just outside of Cincinnati. I went to his boyhood home in Georgetown, Ohio. I went to the site of his home, his beach home in Long Branch, New Jersey, right on the beach. It was sadly torn down by short-sighted politicians in the local area. This is a tragedy that house, beautiful house, was torn down.
Well, I do have a quick question going on that. Of all the places that you went to on your kind of tour to learn more about Grant, what was the coolest place that you went to, or the most memorable?
I mean, they're all cool to me, but I think the most memorable place would have been where he died, which is now called Grant Cottage. It was called Drexel Cottage when Grant went there in the late spring of 1885. Grant had withered down from almost 200 pounds to, I think he was down to like 110 or something. It was ridiculous. He had throat cancer, and it was so painful for him to swallow that he couldn't eat. And so the cancer was just eating away at him. And it was starting to get hot in New York City, amongst the concrete and the stones of the city. It just gets boiling hot in the summer. And so a friend of his was named Drexel, and he was part owner of a hotel, a beautiful resort. Unfortunately, it burned down years later, but it was a beautiful resort on Mount McGregor, just outside of Saratoga, New York.
Wow.
And the resort burned down, but the Drexel home, where Grant went to spend his last 5 or 6 weeks of his life, is still there.
Okay.
And so in the summer of 2018, my daughter Margot and I went to Saratoga. We went to the races, but it was boiling hot. It was like 95 degrees. There was very little shade. So we only stayed for like 3 races. And then we went the next morning up onto Mount McGregor, and we did the full tour. And the amazing thing about Grant Cottage is that everything is exactly in the same place it was the moment that Grant died in July of 1885. His son stopped the clock only minutes after Grant died, and that clock is still exactly there where it was stopped by Fred Grant on that day when he died.
Think about that foresight.
What's that?
Think about that foresight to have that in your. My father just passed away. Let's preserve this moment in time for
and
all
that no
eternity.
one started it back up. That's
right. Yeah. Wow.
The only thing that's different is that they have the flowers, some of the flower arrangements from Grant's funeral, which is amazing that they still have those, but they sprayed them with some sort of a preservative spray, and they're still there. There's a velvet rope that goes across the parlor, and so you can't go in to touch them.
Wait, so the actual flowers from his grave are still alive and still...
Yeah, just a couple. But I've seen the original photographs of those flowers, and then I saw them in real life at the Grant Cottage.
Wow,
The
that's
bed
crazy.
where he died is still there. And the other amazing thing is that Ulysses did not want to have any morphine or opiates during the day because he knew that he was racing against time to write his memoirs. And so he was in unbelievable pain as the cancer it shredded the inside of his throat to the point where there would be times when he would start to choke because pieces of his throat were lodged in his throat, and he would either cough them up or sometimes he would vomit them up. And he said one time that he vomited up a stringy piece of flesh about the size of a small lizard. That's what cancer does to your body.
I just had dinner. Thank you.
And there was one night
Wow.
when he almost died. It was actually
Wow, that's gotta be.
sometime in March of 1885, because he couldn't breathe because all that garbage was getting crammed into his throat. And they thought he was dying, and they actually brought his minister to the bedside to baptize him and to pray for him as he was dying. And then the appearance of death came over his face, and the two physicians, Dr. Douglas and Dr. Schrady, had a syringe filled with brandy, pure brandy, and they gave him the first shot and nothing changed. So then they gave him a second shot, and all of a sudden he got more animated, and he started to cough, and he was coughing so violently that everybody thought this was it. He was dying. But then he threw up a fist-sized chunk of junk, and that released it, and his color immediately changed. He was able to breathe, and he ended up living April, May, June, July. He died in July. But that was the most amazing place for me, was the Grant Cottage. And by the way, the director of the Grant Cottage, Ben, let me open it up here.
Actually,
Ben
I read
Kemp.
that today. I read his forward today.
Yeah, Ben Kemp. I don't know if you could see that or not, but the director of the Grant Cottage wrote the foreword to Victor, the Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant. And he was extremely helpful. I had a lot of questions, and we would bat things back and forth on email. But I highly recommend, if you want a great historical trip, go check out Grant Cottage just outside of Saratoga on Mount McGregor.
Ah, cool.
So
yeah, go back to the original question. Yeah.
To finish your original question, so what happened is that LPC Books, which is a subsidiary of Iron Stream Media, they were the ones that published I Am Cyrus, Harry S. Truman and the Rebirth of Israel. And so when I wrote Victor, I went ahead and asked if they were interested in publishing Victor as well. And after consideration, they agreed that they would do that, but they asked if I would write leadership principles, because they do a lot of leadership books and have a lot of people that buy their books that are interested in leadership. So they asked if I would write a series of leadership principles at the end of every chapter in Victor, which is a biography. And I demurred because that's not what is normally done in biographies. Mm-hmm. And it would have to be like a coffee table or special edition book to do something like that. And so I just, politely said, no, I don't feel comfortable with that. So that night I was talking to Margot, again, my daughter, and I was telling her about this. And she said, well, Dad, why don't you go ahead and just write a book about the leadership principles of Ulysses S. Grant? And I'm like, that's why she's the smart one, and I follow her. And so the next morning I sent an email to the publisher with that suggestion, and immediately, within 2 minutes, he wrote back and he said, "This is amazing. We're sitting here as an editorial team, and we were just saying, well, maybe Craig should just write a second book about the leadership principles of Ulysses S. Grant." So the first book took 2.5 years to do the research and the writing. This book took 2.5 months. And it was a bit exhausting, I have to admit.
And it wasn't just because that's how long it took. That's how long they gave you time to do it, right?
That's exactly right. So I had to get it done. And they actually extended the time for me.
Right. I do remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was very grateful. And I told them, I said, I could finish in the time allotted, but it wouldn't be as strong. If I can have another month, it'll be much stronger. And so I do feel very good about the book and how it turned out.
Awesome. Well, I do have a couple questions about specific chapters. I'm going to bounce around a little bit if you're okay with that.
I'm okay to bounce.
All right. So the first question I have comes, what is Grant's superstition that led to chapter 2, which is titled No Backward Steps?
Grant had, they called it almost a superstition. I think it was a superstition, in that he had a lot of difficulty with going back and retracing his steps. So in that, he was a typical man who doesn't like to ask direction, doesn't like to go back. He would go around in a large circle or square and then come back around, so that to get to a place he had already passed, he was getting to it going forward. That's true.
And is that where the title comes from?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But much more. And I'll tell you about the much more part in a moment, because that superstition served him extremely well in the Civil War, and it helped to win the war. So I'll get to that in a moment. But he'd circle back, Kelly said, but he would circle around. He wouldn't go backwards. He would go around, so that when he came back to the place, he was going forward.
So he never retraced the steps.
Correct. This almost brought a major calamity after the Battle of the Wilderness. That's a major part of the Victor book, and it's actually an incredibly important moment in American history, which was captured by Dr. Schrady's son, who became a sculptor, and he sculpted the statue of Ulysses S. Grant that is in front of the Capitol building. And it captures this moment when Grant said, "We're not going to retreat." Even though the Wilderness it looked like a draw, and in reality, it was a Confederate victory, percentage-wise, and in terms of just the casualties that happened to the Union. And so Grant said, "We're going to press forward." And so after dark, on the third day after the beginning of the Battle of the Wilderness, the Army of the Potomac moved out of its trenches there in the Wilderness and started moving south and west towards Spotsylvania. Now, Robert E. Lee was a brilliant general, and he had said to his commanders, "I already know Grant's next move. He's going to move to the crossroads at Spotsylvania." And so Lee dispatched his forces at the same time. Now, he didn't know that from a spy. He just knew it in his gut, and he was absolutely right. And so the two armies were moving parallel down different roads that were only a few miles apart, not very far at all. And so Grant wanted to get out in front to get down to Spotsylvania as quickly as he could. And so they got a guide to take a small group of Grant's staff down this road. And they moved off into this kind of a side road, and they started moving, and the woods got thicker and thicker and darker, and the path got smaller and smaller. And Colonel Horace Porter, who wrote an excellent book called Campaigning with Grant, which tells the eyewitness stories about the battles of the Overland Campaign in Appomattox, he started to get suspicious that this guy was a Confederate spy that was leading them. And he put his hand on his gun because he almost was going to shoot the guy because it was getting to be very dangerous. And so Porter and some of the other staff members said, sir, we really need, it sounds like there's troops up ahead. We need to send somebody ahead to make sure that it's our people and not the Confederates. And so they sent a scout, and only minutes later he came back, rushing back, saying, we got to turn back. It's the whole Confederate army. We got to go back. And Grant was like, wait, we don't have to go back. There must be another way. They're in the thick of the forest. And the staff is like, General Grant, there's no other way. He said, surely there must be another way. And the scout said, no, I'm sorry, General. This is the only way. The only other thing we can do is go back to where we started and then go down from there. And it was the one time, and there may have been others, but the one time we know about where Grant almost said no, but in the end, they convinced him that he had to go back. Later,
you're going to die if you go forward.
Or become a prisoner. Right, imagine what a trophy that would be if the lieutenant general over the entire Union Army was captured by the Confederates, and he was within 1 mile of that happening. But the good thing is that when he spoke with President Lincoln, he said, we're not going to do what we did before, because every other general who was over the Army of the Potomac before this, and there were 6 of them, they would fight a battle and then they would retreat, because it was almost always a Confederate victory. And they would, even when it was a Union victory, they would retreat. They wouldn't press on to destroy the Confederate army, which drove Abraham Lincoln nuts after the 2 victories, which was Antietam, where the Army of Northern Virginia was greatly damaged. And had McClellan attacked the next day, he could have won the war that day. Wow. The same thing after Gettysburg. The Army of Northern Virginia was greatly damaged after Gettysburg, and Meade did not attack until much later. They gave the Lee a whole day of advance opportunity to get away. And by the time they did catch up with them, the Army of Northern Virginia was just finishing its cross across the Army the river, the Potomac River, and that was the end of that opportunity. And so Grant told Lincoln, there will be no backwards steps. We will fight them and then we'll push forward. We'll fight them and push forward. And so the moment when the Battle of the Wilderness was done, they were going to down this road, the Brock Road, and there was a T. And if they turned left, they would go north back to Washington. If they turned right, they'd head south towards Richmond. And everybody watched. What is Grant going to do? What is Grant going to do? And when he got to that T, he turned right and started moving down towards Richmond. And everyone who could see it of the Army of the Potomac started yelling, throwing their hats and their knapsacks in the air. They lit torches. They lit pine branches on fire and were waving them. And everybody was yelling so much that Grant's horse started to buck and whinny, and he had a hard time getting control. And the Confederates, who were about a mile away or a little more than a mile away, heard the noise, and they started shooting their cannons towards the Army of the Potomac. They landed harmlessly in the woods, too short. But the point being that everybody was thrilled that Grant was moving forward. And then he solidified that after and actually during the Battle of Spotsylvania, which was one of the most gruesome battles in American history. There's stories of bodies being buried in rifle pits in the mud 8 and 10 deep. So they would fall, and then somebody fall on top, and somebody would fall on top, and they just get pressed down into the mud. It was horrific battle.
On both sides?
Yes. Oh, wow. More on the Confederate side. Spotsylvania was more of a Union victory, but just barely. It was just hell on both sides. But then Grant was asked if he wanted to write a letter to President Lincoln. And he said, well, normally I send my dispatches through the Secretary of War, Stanton. And so he did that, and he wrote this short letter, and he closed it with one of the statements that became one of his most famous sayings, and that was, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." Well, it took all summer, all fall, all winter, and most of the spring. But in April of 1865, he finally brought the Confederates to their knees and had the surrender of Lee and his army at Appomattox.
Very cool. So jump into chapter 8. So the strategy behind chapter 8, apply constant pressure until breakthrough, help the Union win the Civil War. So tell us a little more about Grant's strategy.
Well, I touched on it in the last question, but to press it forward, Grant had all of the advantages in terms of men, supplies, and support from the Federal Army, and a huge population of the North. The North was, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I believe it was 3-1. The population was that much bigger. And remember that when I say 3-1, I'm including the African-American slaves. So it was really even bigger than that, because those slaves, up until the very end of the war, did not fight for the Confederacy. So the Union almost had an unending supply of men. So why did Pope lose? Why did McClellan lose? Why did Hooker lose? Why Meade won Gettysburg, but then he lost at Mine Run, and he didn't really follow up aggressively? Why? Why did these other generals, Burnside at Fredericksburg, why did they lose, but Grant won? Well, there's many different reasons, but probably the most important reason was that Grant said, we're going to fight them and we're not going to let go. And we're going to fight them every day until the end of the war. And later on, in the late part of 1864, there was a series of what were called the draft riots in New York City. And if you ever saw the movie The Gangs of New York, that's about the draft riots. And
with Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yes, and Leonardo Titanic. And so the whole point was that these minority groups in New York City said, we don't want to go fight this war. We want to stay here in New York, and we've got it good, and we're not signing up, and we're going to resist the draft, right?
Right.
So the chief of staff in Washington, D.C. was a man named General Halleck. Halleck, I'm not a fan of Halleck. He had some good qualities, and he was a good administrator, but he was not very good at strategy. And so he wrote to General Grant, sent a telegram, and said, I think we need to dispatch troops from around Petersburg and Richmond, where they were doing a siege of the Army of Northern Virginia, and send some of them up to New York and to other places to quell these riots. And Grant said, what? He said, no, that's the job of the police. That's the job of the militias. That is not the job of the Federal Army. Our job is to tie down the Confederate armies. And that's what Halleck did before, was that he would not tie down the armies. They would attack, then they'd retreat, attack and retreat. So the Confederate armies could go anywhere they wanted, and they did. And so, for example, the year before, in 1863, there was an emergency in Chattanooga. And so Lee sent Longstreet to reinforce Bragg. And by doing that, they were able to surround the Union Army and cause a siege. And Lincoln thought that they were going to lose the Army of the Cumberland. It was a true emergency. And it was because they did not contain the Confederate armies. Well, Grant learned all of that by watching from a distance. And he said, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to fight them and fight them and fight them. So when Grant said that about the draft riots and said, I'm not willing to let any of the troops go from Virginia, Abraham Lincoln responded to the telegram and said, "Neither am I willing. I want you to hold on with a bulldog grip and to chew and to choke as much as you can." So Grant and Lincoln were in complete agreement. And it was that strategy, along with a few other very important things, that helped to win the war.
Awesome. So, what is the event from the beginning of the Civil War that taught Grant the lesson of Chapter 5? Remember, your enemies fear you.
I've shared.
I like that title.
Yeah, and it's true. I've shared this before. I mean, look at Remember the Titans. We were talking about that movie earlier today.
Mm-hmm.
And when you see that, one of the things that the coaches taught their players was intimidate the enemy. Well, Grant was extremely intimidated when he first had to take command as a colonel of a regiment in Illinois. And his commander was General Fremont, who had been the first Republican nominee for president, going up against Buchanan. Of course, he lost. But Lincoln named him as the top general in the West. And Fremont had done some work with Grant before, and he was very impressed with Grant's organizational skills and leadership. And so he sent Grant to go against these Confederate vigilante bands, guerrilla bands that were in Missouri. Now, one of the people in one of those bands was none other than Samuel Clemens, who we know as Mark Twain. So there was a chance that Grant and Twain were just within a short distance of each other at one point,
I think that's
and almost fought against each other. Later, we've talked about this, that Mark Twain wrote a wonderful short story about this and embellished it to make it very humorous. And Ulysses S. Grant, as he was dying of cancer, loved that short story, and he loved his time with his good friend Mark Twain, who, by the way, was the one who published Grant's memoirs, because Twain had his own publishing company, and so they were able to work together. But in these early days in Missouri, Grant was leading his regiment up this hill, and he shares in his memoirs that as he's getting higher and higher up the crest of the hill, his heart was growing higher and higher in his throat, and his heart was racing, and he was sweating. And he said the strange thing was that when he fought as a soldier, he didn't have that kind of reaction. He was much more calm. But now he was in charge, and everybody was looking to him for leadership and for the answers. And he was terribly nervous about his first encounter with the enemy. But when they got to the top of the hill and they looked over into the valley where they knew the Confederates had been, they found that the Confederates had retreated. And there were just, hints that they had been there, some campfires that were black, and the grass was beaten down and all that kind of thing.
They were not into low impact camping.
No, they were out of there. And so Grant said that his heart returned to its normal rate, and he learned a lesson. He said, "I realized then that the enemy was as afraid of me as I was afraid of the enemy." And so that was a leadership principle that he employed the rest of his time as a general. He knew that he could use the fear of the enemy against them. And so he was all about surprise attacks whenever he could. And quite often he would attack at 4 o'clock in the morning. As soon as the first sliver of light broke over the horizon, he would attack, because a lot of times the Confederates were not looking for that, and it gave them the advantage not only of surprise, but of fear. Now, again, Lee was a brilliant general as well, and very quickly he recognized this in Grant, and so he always woke his troops up right at the crack of dawn so that they were ready just in case of an attack.
And also that statement kind of reminds me of what you're told as a little kid or even as an adult when you come across an animal, and they always say, you don't do anything because that snake's just as afraid of you as it is. that snake is just as afraid of you as you are of it,
Yeah.
or a bear or something like, yeah, not so much. You don't know how terrified I am right now.
Right.
So going back to chapter 1, so what is the story behind chapter 1, leading is serving?
Well, all of this comes right out of the teachings of Jesus Christ. He taught about the concept of, in order to be a leader, you must be servant of all. And so this is a Judeo-Christian concept that, interestingly enough, in the 20th century, researchers came to realize through an empirical research that it actually works. Back in the pre-World War II days, there was the concept was strong leadership with an iron fist, heavy fist. You stay at your desk from 8 a.m. until 5 p.m. You only move if you raise your hand and ask if you could go to the bathroom. It was sweatshops. It was, just very heavy-handed micromanagement, and leadership theorists and academics like Deming in particular started to do experiments to see how workers responded to that type of leadership as opposed to more servant leadership where you work as a team. And each person who has expertise can speak into that team from their expertise. And the leader, though that leader may have a certain amount of expertise, they recognize that the individual more than likely has higher expertise than they do in their particular niche.
Right.
And so the leader will take in all the information, will ponder it, will think about it, will do his or her own research, and then they will come to a decision. So yes, there's still a leader, but the leader looks very much to the input of the team. And there's a lot more flexibility. There's a lot more creativity. There's a lot more freedom. And that freedom, the researchers found, actually fosters more creativity, more creative ideas. It gives people the feeling of liberty that then makes them want to work harder because they say, I'm being respected. I am being listened to. People are interested in what I have to say. And though they may not agree with everything I say, they're giving it an actual listen, and decisions are being made with input from the key stakeholders. And Deming and others found out that not only does it work much better than the pre-World War II version of top-down leadership, it works dramatically better. And that was then what happened is that the Japanese economy was devastated after World War II. And so they were looking for ways to rebuild their economy. And so Deming, I don't remember the circumstances exactly, but Deming was invited to go to Japan, and he shared his theories on team leadership and quality. And the Japanese put those theories into practice. And that is why Japanese products and cars and electronics are the best and the most expensive in the world, because of Deming, because of the team leadership concept, and because of the quality concept. Years later, this was late 1940s, early 1950s when the Japanese employed these things. The Americans didn't start to do this until the industry started to slide, and the Japanese were taking over the car market, the electronics market, the steel market. And the Americans were like, what do we do? What do we do? And they said, oh, maybe we should look at Deming. And so Deming didn't get put into place until the mid 1970s, the 80s, and even into the 90s. And you would probably remember Ford said, quality is job one. Well, that's Deming. And it was Deming's information from the 1920s through the 1940s that Ford finally caught up with in the 1980s and 90s.
Wow.
And so it was the same with Grant. Grant was a servant leader. He was he would give orders, but before he did, especially when it was a key decision, he would gather his staff together. And it was very democratic. He would ask them to debate the subject and everybody give their opinion. And Grant usually didn't say a word. He just sat back with his cigar and listened to everyone. And then he would sit in his tent. And Horace Porter said that he looked like the laziest man in the army. He'd just sit there smoking and thinking, or maybe whittling and thinking. And people wondered, what in the world are you doing? You know, we got an army that we need to lead. What are you doing? But what he was doing is he was fighting the battle in his head. Days, months, or days, weeks, and sometimes months before he ever fought it on the ground. And so his servant leadership and his strategic thinking helped to win the war. And that's why, while, you know, I give great props to Robert E. Lee for his ability, I think Grant was just as good a general, and it could be argued even a better general.
Cool. So how did General Grant follow the advice in chapter 3, find the advantage in every setback?
This was one of the things that I really appreciated about Grant and that I really learned. You know, all of us have setbacks in life. You know, we talk about taking 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes 1 step forward, 2 steps back, sometimes no steps forward, 3 steps back.
Right.
Well, Grant had a few of those 3 steps back. The 2 that come to mind the most were when he was drummed out of the army for being an alcoholic. And he was caught drunk on duty on more than one occasion. And so his commander, this was out in California, his commander said, either you face court-martial or you resign. And Grant couldn't face the possibility of court-martial. And so he resigned and he went back to St. Louis, where his father-in-law had a plantation. Now, his father-in-law gave him several acres of land and a slave to help farm that land. And Grant went to work, and he was actually criticized by his neighbors because he worked right alongside the slave.
Oh, wow.
And they said, that's not the place for a white man. You make the slave work and you just give the directions. Well, Grant was not going to do that. Grant was raised in an abolitionist family, and so he had very different ideas of human interaction and racial relations. And though he owned that slave, he worked with that slave and treated that slave very fairly. And unfortunately, right when Grant was farming his land, the country got hit with one of the first great financial depressions. And so not only did Grant have difficulty in farming the land, but then when this depression hit, that was it, because he could not now make money off of his farming. And the same thing happened in the Great Depression of the 1930s. The farmers were hit terribly by the Depression. And so there are people who said that Grant was a sluggard or was not very good at business. Well, I would agree on the business side. He didn't have the best business mind, but he was a hard worker. And when it came to farming, he did know what he was doing. He did all the right things, but you can't survive a financial depression.
Right.
But he kept working and kept working and kept working until it became apparent that he couldn't make a go at it. Now, years later, there were many people who gave descriptions of Grant as stoop-shouldered. They said that his shoulders were stooped. Well, the reason was that he worked so hard on that farm, getting right down in the dirt, getting behind the plow and the horse or the mule, chopping wood, cutting wood, whatever was necessary to take care of his family. And it caused a permanent stooping of his shoulders.
Huh.
And so that was one of the times where he just had to keep pressing. What happened in the end was that he recognized that slavery was a cancer on the country and it was tearing the country apart. And so at his worst time financially, he could have sold that slave and made $1,000, which in the 1850s, in 1859, that was a lot of money. But instead, he decided to give that slave his freedom. And we don't know. Grant never wrote down why he did it, but we can surmise that Grant saw that slavery was tearing the country apart, and he didn't want to contribute to the thing that was a cancer on the country.
Right.
And so he sacrificed his own well-being and the well-being of his family and gave freedom to that slave. And then he went and humbled himself and worked for his father, who had a chain of leather goods stores throughout the North or throughout the Midwest. And he was just a clerk in this leather goods store working for his two younger brothers, which would have been completely humiliating for a graduate of West Point, a hero of the Mexican War. But Grant, many people believe that he knew the war was coming, and he was preparing himself, placing himself back in the North, because he said to others, the federal government paid for my education at West Point, and so I owe them my allegiance and my industry. And so when the war broke out, as we said earlier, he actually could not get back in because people said, oh, he's a drunk, we don't want him. Right. But then it got to be to the point where they really, really needed trained leadership. And so Governor Yates heard that Grant had done a great job as a mustering officer. And many of the other officers said, we want him. He's really good. And so Yates knew that he needed officers. So he took a chance, and it was the greatest chance that he ever took, because Grant was immediately, Yates named him as a colonel over a regiment. Within 6 months, Fremont named him as a brigadier general. Within a year, Lincoln named him as a major general. And then within a year after that, he was named lieutenant general over all the armies of the United States. And 4 years later, he was president of the United States. From clerk to president of the United States in 7 years. Amazing story.
Talk about that career trajectory.
Yeah. So
I need that kind of career trajectory.
It's coming for you. John C. Farrell, you keep those dance moves going, and you're going to move up that ladder. You're going to be on Broadway, my friend.
You have to have musical ability and dancing ability or singing ability, of which I have.
But you have acting chops.
Yes, I do have. I do act.
Let's take this moment, because we're running out of time. Let's take this moment to give a commercial to John C. Farrell of the renowned Concord Players. Is that the name of it?
No.
But you do act in Concord, North Carolina.
Yeah, it's the old Courthouse Theater in Concord.
I was
downtown
close.
Concord. Yes.
I had Concord.
There's no Concord in it. It's Old Courthouse.
Right, but then you said in Concord.
Yeah, well, that's not part of the name.
I got that
just right. Location. It's just the location.
So it's the old Concord Courthouse Theater of Albemarle, starring John
wrong
C.
county,
Farrell.
wrong county, wrong city. It's the old Courthouse Theater
of Concord,
which happens to be located in Concord, North Carolina.
Now, your most recent thespian outage was you played the doctor. Is that right?
Yes, actually, I played the two doctors in The Miracle Worker.
The Miracle Worker, the story of
Annie Sullivan and Helen Keller.
Yes.
And I actually played the doctor at the very beginning of the play.
You kind of look like a doctor.
Yeah, maybe that's why I was cast as two doctors in the play. But I was cast as the doctor who misdiagnoses Helen Keller at the beginning of the
quack.
Right, especially yes, he was, because he told Helen Keller's parents that she probably just has like stomach issues, like a stomach bug. Well, if you know who Helen Keller was, she was actually blind and deaf. So a serious misdiagnosis. And then
what is the next play going to be at the Concord Courthouse Theater?
Well, they just did another show called Nonsense.
And you said it was very good.
Oh, it was excellent. It was a very, very good. I had read it before because I'm on the programming committee at the Old Courthouse Theater. But but I had never seen it, and I'd heard many, many great things about it. And it's a small cast of 5 women or 5 females, because there's there's a teenager in the show as well. But they were all very, very good. It was an excellent show.
When can we see John C. Farrell once again?
Whenever I audition,
bright lights.
Whenever I audition again.
What's your plan? Tell us. Can you give us, your adoring public, a sneak peek?
I probably won't be auditioning anything in the upcoming season.
So you're out of commission. All right. Well, in that case, then we have to talk about NASCAR.
All right. Do you have a question for me?
No, you have a question for me, I believe.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to ask you what the most exciting NASCAR race is, or what's the most exciting finish in a NASCAR race ever.
Now, earlier we were talking about this, and I proposed Jocko Flocko, because to have a NASCAR win with a chimpanzee, to me,
wasn't a chimpanzee. Wasn't a chimpanzee.
It was a primate of some sort, right?
It was a rhesus monkey.
I could go all over the place with Reese's.
I said Reese's.
Oh, Reese's. All right.
Reese's. I didn't say Reese's.
I thought that maybe this was like the mascot of Reese's.
There's something there. A Reese Pieces monkey.
Yeah, we're not going to go there. Yeah. All right. So that was my answer, and you said that I was.
Well, I said, well, it's a great thing about America. Everybody can have different opinions.
So according to you and your NASCAR book for dummies, that is not the most exciting finish.
And again, it's not NASCAR for dummies, but I digress.
What's the name of the book again?
The official NASCAR trivia book.
Official NASCAR trivia book by John C. Farrell. So yes. John C. Farrell, tell us, enlighten us, please. What is the most exciting NASCAR finish?
Kelly's shaking her head. I don't know if she's shaking it at me or you. Probably both of us. In my opinion, it's the very, very first, the inaugural Daytona 500 in 1959. And the reason NASCAR came into play in 1948, but the first race was actually not until 1949. So there'd been racing already for 10 years before the Daytona 500 came around. And it basically came down to Lee Petty, who the name Petty might sound familiar. Lee Petty was the father of Richard Petty.
The guy with the big hat.
Yes, who has 200 wins in the NASCAR Premier Series.
Doesn't he have some lineage too?
What do you mean?
Is it Kyle?
Yeah, Kyle Petty is his son.
Right.
And
so
Adam.
3 generations?
Well, there was 4. And
4
actually,
now?
Well,
they're like rabbits.
Kyle had a son named Adam Petty who tragically died back in 2000, early 2000s. I forget the exact year, but he one of the maybe next week I'll talk a little bit about Victory Junction Camp, which is a philanthropic camp that was his vision that the Pettys kind of took under their wing after Adam Petty tragically died. It's a great story. I've had a chance to go visit it in Randleman, North Carolina, or near Randleman, North Carolina. And it's really cool. But anyways, the race came down. I digress again. So in the race, in the 1959 Daytona 500, it came down to a guy by the name of Johnny Bucamp and Lee Petty. And it was and they crossed the finish line at the very, very same time. And so
photo finish, I believe is what they call it.
So to speak, yes. So they automatically gave the award, the trophy, to Johnny Bucamp, thinking that, hey, he won the race, and there was no one to dispute it because it was so close. They didn't have a way to do instant replay at that time. And so, however, over the next couple days, Lee Petty lodged a formal complaint. And so they started looking back at newsreels and photos of the finish. And 3 days after the race was over, they re-awarded the race win to Lee Petty and
Thus the name photo finish.
Right. And so they took the trophy and the prize check away from Johnny Bucamp and gave it to Lee Petty.
Ooh.
So that had to burn.
Yeah, I wonder if he had to like get it out of his bank. That would be bad.
I think he refused at first because hey, you gave this money to me,
right?
But yeah. I'm not 100% sure. I'd have to go research what his. I think they finally did get the money back from Johnny so.
But that sounds like an exciting finish to me, John C. Farrell.
So, yeah,
and all of this is documented in the NASCAR for Dummies by John C. Farrell. Am I right?
Again, not NASCAR for Dummies. That is a separate book written by Mark Martin.
I keep giving him love.
It's
Ghostwritten. I should be saying the trivia book for dummies by John C. Farrell.
There's no for dummies.
Oh, believe me, there is lots for dummies.
Well, I'm talking to one, but that's okay.
Exactly.
Now it's now
let me see that cover one more time.
There is no word dummies anywhere on it.
The official NASCAR trivia book by John C. Farrell, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay.
And you can order this on Amazon.com.
Quick question. What track is this?
That's got to be Talladega.
You're right. It is Talladega.
I totally guessed.
I was very, very surprised that you got that.
That was a complete, total guess. I had no idea. The only one I knew that it wasn't was Bristol, because I've not been in.
Well, that's a small coliseum.
I used to live 10 minutes from Bristol racetrack, and so I saw it on TV. I never went inside, but I would have known that one. But
the world's loudest coliseum.
What was that?
The world's loudest coliseum.
I can't hear you. Can you say that again? All right. Well, we are going to wrap with that. And just a reminder that you're able to now order the companion book to Victor. And that book is called Forward, The Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant. You can order that at grantforwardbook.com or wherever books are sold. You can also order Victor, The Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant, which is a biography of the last 2 years during one of the most dramatic points in his amazing life. And this can be purchased at GrantVictorBook.com.
Can you purchase them as a bundle?
You can only purchase them as a bundle if you buy both of them at full price. So no, sorry.
All right.
It's not up to me. That's up to
I understand. I understand.
Maybe they will put it out as a bundle, but they have not told me that yet. So, all right. So just a little bit of a programming note. We're going to be off for the next 2 weeks, but we will be airing best of programs during that time. But we will be back again the week after. So that would be 3 weeks from tonight. And John, you're going to have to tell me what the date is on that. It's 12th.
Hold, please.
The 17th. Am I right?
No.
I think I am.
Yeah, you are. I just didn't want to.
That's 2 for 2, man. Talladega and June 17th. So we will be back.
Well, no, it's actually 2 for 3. You missed the one about the race.
Oh, all right. So 2 for 3. That's still pretty good. I would be in the Hall of Fame if I was a pitcher. So for John C. Farrell, I am Craig Von Buzik. Thank you for joining us. And we will see you back here on June 17th. Same what? Bat time. Same bat
channel.
Broadcast channel.
KCWC.
All right. Take care. Good night, everybody.
Bye.